Hi folks, today we are looking at 4 institutions that touch the rural Alaskan economy, specifically the permanent fund dividend, Alaska Native corporations, healthcare, and education. All 4 of these are big topics, and we could spend an entire semester on any one of these. And in fact, UAF does have classes that are semester-long courses on several of these. So today is really an introduction to look at the intersection of the rural Alaskan economy and these 4 institutions. So first up, permanent fund dividends. If you are unfamiliar with the permanent fund, it is a sovereign wealth fund that was set up in the late 70s to manage the oil and resource wealth created in the state of Alaska. And it started paying dividends to all Alaskan residents in 1982. So economists consider this a form of universal basic income. It's a payment made to all Alaskan residents, whether you are rich or poor. So in the context of rural Alaska, we're specifically interested in whether it's helped reduce poverty in rural Alaska. Of course, the PFD had other purposes besides for just reducing poverty, but that's kind of something we'll set aside, and you can read about it a little bit in the assigned reading or follow up outside of this class on that. But in terms of being a poverty reduction tool, PFDs are a little bit costly because they are universal. So it's not as targeted as setting up a program or making direct payments to people who are actually poor. Instead, it's offering a payment to everyone who's an Alaskan resident. But as Berman finds in his 2018 study, it is actually a pretty effective tool for reducing poverty. So Berman looked at data focusing mostly on the period between 2000 and 2015. And on average, across that period, Alaska Natives were about 2.5 times more likely to live below the poverty line than non-Alaska Natives. But compared to kind of a baseline data point from 1990, there was a meaningful reduction in poverty for rural Alaska Natives that Berman attributes to the permanent fund dividend. Some of the trend lines are not as clear for Alaska Native children, but when Berman made some adjustments to account for the fact that many children live in households where parents aren't married, and the census data doesn't reflect that as a single household, then you do actually see poverty reduction amongst children as well. And there is a clear poverty reduction trend for Alaska Native seniors. Berman also provided some support to show that the permanent fund dividend doesn't substantially reduce income earned from work. So people aren't receiving their permanent fund dividend and quitting their job. So there isn't much of a substitution effect. And in case you're wondering about the average size of a permanent fund dividend, in recent years, it has averaged a little bit over $1,000 a year per person. On the other hand, and Berman also found positively, it doesn't substantially increase expenditures on sin products, like sales of alcohol don't typically go up in the state after permanent fund dividend payments are made, which was one argument against continuing permanent fund dividend payments. So on the flip side, Berman also finds that permanent fund dividends are becoming less impactful over time as a tool of poverty reduction. So essentially the amount of the permanent fund dividend has been although it fluctuates year to year, it has been decreasing as a share of income. And so it's a less important tool in reducing poverty. So all in all, the findings were fairly positive on the role that permanent fund dividends play in reducing poverty in rural Alaska. But it's an area that, because the permanent fund dividend amount fluctuates year to year, and the overall rate of poverty in rural Alaska and in specific groups also fluctuates, this is something that continues to be an interesting topic for economists to study. Next, we look at Alaska Native corporations. So we talked about Alaska Native corporations a bit earlier in this class, and the Berman article you're assigned for this course that discusses mostly permanent fund dividends also talks a little bit about what Alaska Native corporations are. So Alaska Native corporations were established in 1971, and most pay dividends annually, and it works a little bit like a permanent fund dividend, but these are not universal because they only go to the shareholders of these corporations. So they are limited not only just to Alaska Natives, but even within the population of Alaska Natives. Not all Alaska Natives are shareholders in Alaska Native corporations for a variety of reasons. Some of these corporations that were established in 1971 haven't opened up shareholder status to future generations. So the only way younger members of the community become shareholders is by inheriting shares. So these are certainly not universal. There is more fluctuation between Alaska Native corporations in terms of the amount they pay out each year. There's this chart that's at the bottom of the slide. And you can see there are a few oil-rich regions, like the North Slope, that's ASRC represents the North Slope, that have fairly consistent higher dividends versus other regions, like you can see Chalista, where dividends tend to be lower because this is a region that doesn't have a lot of resource wealth. There is and this is probably beyond the scope of this course, but there is some ways that revenues are shared between these corporations, and these are just the regional Alaska Native corporations. On this chart, it's not the village level corporations, but in general, you can see about the size of magnitude of these dividend payments. So because there's more fluctuation both between these different regional corporations and also across years for a single regional corporation compared to the permanent fund dividend, and these are not as universal, and there's also age bias in terms of who holds shares because some classes of shares have not been opened up to younger generations. In general, these dividend payments don't represent quite as strong of a tool for especially child poverty reduction, which is a metric that is focused on quite a bit when we're talking about poverty, because children across the U.S. Are more likely to fall below the poverty line than adults. So one interesting article came out in 2021 written by Bob Snigeroff and Craig Richards, and they suggested an endowment model. So if the money that had been used to set up Alaska Native corporations was instead used to create a wealth fund, sort of like the permanent fund, the dividends across the board would be more consistent and higher. And the economic impact would be higher than the economic impact of Alaska Native corporations. So, of course, that's one perspective, and it is not the only perspective, because Alaska Native corporations do have other effects in the economy besides for just their dividend payments. Alaska Native corporations create jobs, issue scholarships, offer leadership training, and provide other benefits, both tangible and intangible, to the rural economy of Alaska, which may not be fully reflected in a cost-benefit analysis. So I have here one example of an economic impact report that looks at Alaska Native organizations on the interior of Alaska. So this looks at Alaska Native corporations, as well as Alaska Native regional nonprofits and tribal governments. And you can see this table just shows job creation in the interior of Alaska which includes Fairbanks, which is an urban area, as well as the rest of interior, which would fall into our kind of classification of rural Alaska, and how much of that job creation comes from regional corporations, ANCs, as well as ANC village corporations. It's a pretty healthy share. Next, turning our attention to education. So education's already come up in this class in a few ways, because schools and education help provide for the future workforce, right? Prepare people, build up human capital. Schools also are a consistent and reliable source of data for rural Alaska that is otherwise very difficult to come by. Interestingly enough, education requirements are a large reason why permanent villages exist today. In that, a century plus ago, many Alaska Native communities were more seasonal settlements, fish camps, and traveling to account for a subsistence lifestyle. But some of the regulations that require children to be in schools has helped to create these permanent villages, for better or worse, that are a feature of the modern or contemporary rural economy. So these days, schools are a key institution for the contemporary village economy. They account for nearly 20% of local government jobs in the remote regions of Alaska. And economists in the state of Alaska are studying how to attract and retain teachers in rural Alaska. And the most interesting finding is basically that you need to pay them a lot more because the cost of living is very, very high in rural Alaska. Economists are also looking at the economic impact of tribal compacting, which again is a bit beyond the scope of this class, but it relates to instead of the curriculum in schools in these villages being set centrally or by a state controlled school board, the responsibility for that curriculum is turned over to tribes. And some aspects of managing schools might also be turned over to tribes. So that's a topic that does have a lot of different ramifications, some economic, some social, but it's a new area of interest in Alaska. Last but not least, healthcare in the economy. First, let's talk about the relationship between health and economics. So in this class, you've seen how public health is important for economics. So for example, the effect of having a piped water system on transmission of disease, and on a bunch of other demographic and population characteristics. Food security and nutrition is also considered a piece of public health. There's also the impact of access to quality healthcare on other economic and demographic factors, such as this 2011 paper about how the lack of access to quality healthcare in rural Alaska helps accelerate outmigration and people moving to urban areas. Overall, the story of healthcare economics in rural Alaska is a complicated one and an interesting one. There are fewer providers, less private insurance, and so there's really emerged a need for new models of healthcare that include things like telehealth and reliance on like community health aides. So there are several articles, including this one by Golnick et al. In 2012, discussing some of the innovations that have actually come out of necessity in providing healthcare in the rural Alaskan context. The Indian Health Service also plays a large part in providing care in rural Alaska, or I should say Indian Health Services, which is a federal government entity, funds a lot of the healthcare that's provided in rural Alaska, although most of it is actually provided by tribal consortia, as opposed to directly by Indian Health Services. So the actual economics of providing care looks a little bit different than what you might consider in urban markets in the US. So Indian Health Services funds a number of tribally managed hospitals in cities and rural hubs, including Anchorage, Utqiagvik, listed as Barrow here, Bethel, Dillingham, Kotzebue, Nome, Sitka, and Wrangell. They additionally have 72 tribal health centers, 148 tribal community health aid clinics, a number of substance abuse treatment centers. There's a couple organizations. The Alaska Native Medical Center in Anchorage provides specialty care. So there's referred care throughout the state where people are flown into Anchorage if they have special medical needs. And there's also the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, which focuses primarily on public health issues, so health promotion and disease prevention programs. There has not been a lot of Alaska-specific research on improving the cost profile of care in Alaska. Most of the research is focused on health outcomes, and there is some more nationwide research on improving the cost and quality of care provided through Indian Health Services. But these are other areas where economists could tackle some of these big thorny issues, which would have some impact on the rural Alaskan economy.